In 1951, the Home League from the Saltcoats Corps of the Salvation Army, they travelled the 30 miles into Glasgow to visit a mother and children's home there, Salvation Army home. And while they were there, a lady called Tilda Barr and her friend Sarah crossed the road to visit the Glasgow Corporation, which was where babies with no parents lived. So Sarah had been there before because she had actually fostered a baby from there. And so Tilda Barr went with her and they went to see the matron just to say hello. While they were there, they actually met a little boy whose name was John Matheson. And Tilda was taken by this. Tilda Barr was taken by this because, in fact, John Matheson had been her great-grandfather's name, and Matheson was one of her middle names. Now, Tilda already had 4 daughters, but they just moved into a bigger home, and she felt that somehow this was a sign. So she went back to her husband and she said, I want to adopt this little boy who had been born the year before. And so Tilda and her family did. And they adopted John Matheson. And John Matheson became Ian Barr. And so Ian Barr, this little boy who'd been alone in the world, grew up in this loving family and had this extended family that cared for him and looked after him where he belonged. And he grew up in this wonderful corps that looked after him and cared for him. And I do love this story, that a Home League outing to visit Salvation Army home ended up to this adoption that changed this little boy's life. Now, I've met this little boy. He's a retired Salvation Army officer now. His name's Ian Barr, and he was one of our great teachers on Salvation Army. He still is. Sorry, Ian, if you're watching. One of our great teachers on Salvation Army doctrine and Salvation Army theology. And I think about that day, that kind of act of kindness that changed Ian's life, the course of his life. And what was it that led Tilda to do that? Was it merely kindness? Was it a generosity of spirit? Was it just compassion? Or was it love? Was it love? I mean, what does love look like? How do we know when we see it? I want to tell you another story. And this is a true story too. And this story can be found in 2 Samuel 21 if you want to read it. And it's a story of a king, but it's a story also of an extraordinary woman. And this is not a heartwarming story on Mother's Day. It's an awful story, really, of violence. But there's something here for us, I think. Because this too is about a mother. So this is the time in the kingdom of Israel when David had just ascended to the throne. And we're not exactly sure when this story took place. Where it's placed in the book of Samuel we're not exactly sure that that's when it happened chronologically. But the famous David was king. All right, he gradually accumulated power. He'd come to the throne. He'd faced down his enemies. He'd faced down rebellions. But the land was in trouble. There'd been a drought for 3 years. And so David spoke to God. And he went to the people and he said that God had told him that the drought was punishment because of Saul's household, the previous king who David had overcome. And it was because they had mistreated a people called the Gibeonites, who were a remnant of another tribe there in the Middle East. Now, Saul was already dead. And so David went to the Gibeonites and said, well, Saul's already dead. What can we do to make this right? And they said, well, we have no right to put anybody to death or demand anything from you. But please give us 7 of Saul's sons, his descendants, and we will kill them. And David did. He took 2 sons of a woman called Rizpah, who was a concubine to Saul. Now, concubine was different to a wife. It was someone who had status in the household, but often they were there because they'd been chosen by the king. It wasn't a political alliance, all right? It wasn't for power. And so Rizpah was a concubine in Saul's household, and she'd had 2 sons to Saul. And so 2 of her sons and the 5 sons of Merab who was, by the way, David's sister-in-law, were handed over to the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites took them out, and on a hill they exposed them and killed them. And we're not exactly sure what that meant. But they were killed and their bodies were left there on a hill. Their bodies were left there crucified. And I've got a slide, this part of the story, that tells you what Rizpah did. Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on a rock. And from the beginning of the harvest till the rain poured down from the heavens on the bodies, she did not let the birds touch them by day, or the wild animals by night. When David was told what Aiah's daughter Rizpah had done, he went and took the bodies of Saul. Now, this is an extraordinary verse for me. This is an extraordinary story. So Rizpah's sons had been taken, and 5 of her nephews had been taken, and to my mind, senselessly killed. And she kept vigil by the bodies. We actually know that she did that for about 5 months. She took sackcloth, a sign of repentance, and she wouldn't allow the animals to touch the bodies. You see, for a body to be left like that was dishonouring. It was a calculated insult to her sons and to her nephews. So she stayed there. And eventually David finds out. Someone tells him what Rizpah has done. And perhaps shamed, I hope shamed by her actions, he gathered the bones of Saul and Jonathan, which had been left in the hands of their enemies. And he took them and the remains of these 7 men, these 7 sons, and he buried them properly. Now, for me, there's always been a challenge in the Old Testament, and it's not really theology. When I first went to college and began to study, it wasn't theology that challenged me, talking about God. It was really wrestling with this idea of the Old Testament. What did I do with the God that I saw there? We actually know in the law that the law outlawed human sacrifice in the children of Israel. And yet we have 7 men offered up as a sacrifice to appease God's anger. His anger against someone who wasn't even alive. And I don't know what to do with this story. You see, for me, there's so many actions in the Old Testament, and this is where I struggled. And I struggle still, if I'm honest. So many of these actions I just cannot reconcile with Jesus. I cannot believe that the Jesus I know and love would actually demand that 7 people, innocent of any crime, would be offered up as sacrifices. Quite the reverse, in fact. So I have these questions when I read this story. Saul is long dead. Why would God punish a nation? What did Saul do? We have no reference anywhere to the crime that he committed against the Gibeonites. Why was there blood guilt? Why should Saul's sons be offered as a sacrifice? And here's something in this story. If the death of Saul's descendants should have ended the drought, why did the rain not come? Why did it only come when David had responded to Rizpah's brave and lonely vigil? In fact, I would say if this was the only story we had to judge King David, how would we judge him? Less than honourable? Was it convenient that the descendants of Saul, his rival, were gone? Now, in fact, I can't answer those questions. You can sort it out. But there's no question for me that the heroine in this story is Rizpah, not David. Here was a woman who had no political power. Her sons were taken from her. She could do nothing to stop that. But the moral power in this story is with Rizpah. This was a time when actions speak louder than words, when a brave mother shamed a powerful king. And I'm not sure if Jesus would be proud of his ancestor David, but I'm sure he was proud of Rizpah in those lonely months when she defended the bodies of her sons and her nephews from dishonour. And this is kind of a unique story, right? This is an extraordinary circumstance that in one sense we can't imagine today. But I think Rizpah is a type, you see. Not just for me, she models something extraordinary. For me, she's the model of every mother of an innocent child lost. In a way, she's the spiritual mother of Mary, as Mary stands at the foot of the cross when Jesus is there. When all those men had run away, for all their brave words, they'd run away. And Mary was there with her son in his dishonour on that cross. Why did Rizpah do it? Was it kindness? Was it generosity? Was she a compassionate person? Brave? Loving? Or was she all of those things? The very best of those things that are in loving mothers. Now, it'd be foolish to think that all mothers are good and kind. We know that, all right? We live in a real world. We know that people often have difficult and painful relationships with their mums. But nevertheless, this reminds us of the fierce and protective love of mothers. And it's more common than we remember, I think. In a COVID-19 world, we can kind of think that everything's bad, right? That we're surrounded by problems and difficulties and challenges. But funnily enough, COVID-19 has reminded me of the goodness in the world. I think of that great line from that Australian theologian, John Paul Young, who says, love is in the air everywhere you look around. You see, I've seen lots of families walking down our street in a way I've never seen before, the number of people walking with their kids. And when you walk past people, and sure, you step aside, right, to keep the 1.5 metres, but you smile at each other because there's this kind of, we're in this together, right? We all know why we're doing this. And it just reminds me that in my neighbourhood, and in your neighbourhood, there are hundreds and thousands of loving households. We're good, kind, generous, compassionate people, do all they can to love their children and to love them well. And where does that come from? Where does that come from? We wouldn't claim they're all Christians. But to be honest, Christians, we do claim all the goodness in the world. We claim God as the source of all goodness. All goodness comes from Him. All love comes from Him. You see, every human being is made in God's image. It's not something just for Christians. Every human being is made in the image of God. And yes, that image is marred by the fall. And we are flawed and we are fallen, that is true. But the image of God, tarnished as it is in each of us, in every human person. Our capacity to love, our capacity to do good comes from God. And this is built into us. We have the power to choose to sacrifice. We have the power to choose against our instincts, to choose the path of love. You see, I've known mothers whose love has been extraordinary. And not just in defining moments, but in years of patient, generous kindness as they've looked after their children. Children facing crisis, children facing death, children facing illness, children facing grief, and they've cared for them. Now, they've never told me that, but I've seen it in them, you see. I've seen it in their actions. Because sometimes actions speak louder than words. There's unselfish, costly, caring love. I've seen mothers who have this amazing capacity to sacrifice and to endure. And it is the love of God. It is the love from God. It is embodied love. And so we remember it. Not just because we love our mums, but because they point us to God. Now, I don't know how many of you have studied educational theory, but if you have, you will have heard of a guy called Lev Vygotsky. Now, Lev Vygotsky was a Russian, and he wrote about educational theory in the 30s, but it took a long time to come to the West, and it was really by the late 80s that it started to permeate educational thinking. And Lev Vygotsky propounded this theory about the way that we learn and the way we develop psychologically in terms of our skills and our emotions and what it means to be human. And he talked about this thing called the zone of proximal development. And just remember that phrase and try and use it this week because you will sound intelligent. Right? The zone of proximal development. And he said, we have these things. Children have these areas where they're skilled, where they can do all that's required, right? Then they have this area in their life where they can kind of do stuff. And then they have this area where they know nothing about it. And it's in between what we know well and what we don't know at all. That's called the zone of proximal development. That's the zone where we learn, right? Where we come to understanding. And the way we learn in that zone of proximal development is by our interaction with those around us, by skilled others, all right, so who talk to us, who show us, who shape us, who train us. And that gives words and concepts meaning. And it helps us understand our world, understand who we are, helps us develop, helps us acquire skills. You see, how would I know or understand the love of God if I'd not known and seen love? You see, loving mums are object lessons. Do you remember when, you know what an object lesson is? You know, a few weeks ago when Caitlin did her kids' time and she had an empty Easter egg as she sought to explain the empty tomb, right? We use simple things that we know from our lives. Something simple and known to explain something deep and mysterious. I can still remember as a child that someone explained the Trinity to me with an egg. That there was a shell and there was a white and a yolk and there were three but they were one, and that was the Trinity. All right? Taking something simple and known to explain the mysteries of the things we don't understand. And it's in the love we know that helps us understand the love of God. It's an object lesson for us. Imagine if a child had lived in isolation all its life with no interaction with another human being, and then at 8 years old somebody said to them, God is love. It wouldn't mean anything. Loving mother is an object lesson. They point us to God. I believe Rizpah's story points us to God. There's a little twist in her story, by the way. The name Rizpah means hot coal or hot stone. And like me, you might remember Isaiah 6 when you think about a hot coal. Well, Isaiah, when he's called to be the prophet, cries out, he says, I'm a man of unclean lips. And an angel takes a hot coal and touches it to his lips, and he was cleaned and made holy. And in this awful story, violent story, it's made powerful because of Rizpah. Love embodied, politically powerless, but morally powerful. Without Rizpah, you see, we wouldn't talk about this story today. It'd just be a little footnote in history. But she changed it. She changed it. We should thank God for the love expressed in our mothers, in every good mum, in brave, generous, compassionate, loving mothers. And we should remember Rizpah today as a type of every fierce, loving, compassionate mum. May our actions speak as loudly as our words, and may both together make real the love of God in a troubled world that desperately needs to hear of his love. Now, I want us to meditate on this. I think this is an extraordinary story. I've been thinking about this for weeks. And as we think about Rizpah's story, we're going to sing a song, Find Us Faithful. And there'll be some images on the screen that will help us, I hope, picture the story of Rizpah and her lonely vigil and the power in what she did. May it remind us of God and point us to his love as we share this morning.